Hi, my name is Alex. As some of you may know, over the last couple of years, I spent a lot of time researching topic of health and longevity to understand what's driving health and what's helping us prevent disease. And over the last few months, I started publishing articles, and a few of my friends gave me feedback that while those articles are interesting, they're a little bit complex. So I decided to spend a little bit of time talking about the 80-20 longevity strategy. So I decided to record this video, and today we have a few objectives. Number one is I want to provide you a magic pill to stay healthy to 100. Number two is I want to prescribe you the best diet plan. And number three, I want to recommend you the best supplement list. But obviously that's not today's objectives for a few reasons. One is it's not possible to provide a magic pill to stay healthy to 100. No one knows what that magic pill is. We know certain directions which you need to follow to prevent disease, but it's not guaranteed that you're going to stay healthy to 100 or beyond 100. We cannot prescribe the best diet plan because diet plan really depends on your objectives and your own circumstances. And three, we will talk about the supplements, but we're not going to talk about the best supplements or the best supplements that you should take. This is really your personal decision. So the real objectives are as follows. Number one is I want to get you excited about your own health, as I've been excited for many years now. Number two, I want to explain the basics of aging and disease and really talk about a few pathways that are most important to prevent aging and prevent disease. And number three, I want to give you the 80-20 longevity menu. And I want to emphasize the 80-20 because we're really going to talk about the 20% of the inputs that are going to give you the 80% of the health outputs. And a quick disclaimer before we go deeper. Number one is I'm not an MD, so you should take my advice with a grain of salt. And really you should take anyone's advice with a grain of salt. And that's one of the reasons why I started researching the topic, because we should be our own doctors as much as possible. Number two, I'm scientifically minded and I like frameworks. So the stuff you'll hear is science-based, but it's simplified on purpose. So you shouldn't expect deep science here, but it is science-based. And number three, I'm a health nerd since the age of 15, but I wasn't satisfied with the high-level information. And so over the last couple of years, I spent hundreds of hours researching science of health and longevity, and I condensed a lot of the learnings into the seminar. But I really want to highlight that this is not the full picture. It's only the 20% that's going to give you a bunch of the output. And so the first question I want to ask you is, do you actually want to live longer? And I want to share why I want to live longer. I want to introduce my daughter, Sasha, and Sasha is 3 months old. And even though she's only 3 months old, I'm looking forward to meeting her kids and potentially grandkids. And that's why I want to live longer. But when I talk to friends and coworkers and anyone really talking about how long they want to live, the answers are very different. Some people want to live to 80, some people want to live to 60. But the question is, what is normal, right? And we all go through normal life stages. We grow older, we go into adulthood, and then we grow older until the happy end happens. But the question is, what is driving the difference in our own perception of health and our own perception of how long we want to live? And the main thing that's driving this is really the scary part of aging. This is the last probably 20% of your life when you're a lot weaker, your mental capacity is a lot lower, your physical capacity is a lot lower. And so if you think about the longevity, we're trying to really optimize this part where you want to keep your health as strong as possible for as long as possible. And everyone will reach the end, but we do want to keep our health stronger. So now let's dive into what is longevity. And longevity is broadly defined as two things. One is health span, and the other one is lifespan. And health span is really simplistically, it's health quality, and it can be poor and it can be strong. And lifespan is simplistically how many years you live. It can be 50 years, can be 100 years or more. And if we think about what is normal, the normal is usually when your health quality peaks at about the age of 30, and then it starts gradually declining at a small pace. Our bodies are pretty resistant and resilient to stress and resilient to the way we live. So initially from the age of 30 to the age of 70, the decline is not really visible to your eyes every year. It's probably visible every 5 years, every 10 years. But really what's happening, by the age of 70, you would reach about 50% of your health capacity, health quality. And then the next 10 years, your health quality will decline by another 50%. And this is really the scary part of aging, right? From the 30 to 70, health declines at a smaller pace, but from 70 to 80, it declines at a very fast pace. And this portion is really scary because this is visible not only to yourself, where your health quality declines significantly every 6 months, but it's also visible to everyone around you. And the average lifespan in the US right now, it's about 70 to 80 years old. So really we should say 80 years old. And when I talk to friends and other people, how do they think about health? They really think about health as kind of extending this or shortening this duration by about 1 to 2 years, right? They say, I'm not gonna quit smoking, I'm not gonna stop eating sweets, I'm not gonna start working out because I don't really care about this 1 to 2 years at the end of my life. What I care about is I care about enjoying life right now. But I want to say that this is not the right way to think about longevity. Longevity is really, the real prize is a lot bigger, and we're trying to achieve 3 objectives here. Objective number 1 is to make the rate of decline of your health quality a lot slower. So your health would peak at about 30 years old, but then you want to keep a pretty much constant health quality. With a little bit of decline, you cannot keep it at the same level, but it would start declining, but you want to minimize the decline as much as possible. Number 2 is you want to increase the lifespan by a certain number of years. Probably anywhere from 0 to 20 years is possible. No one can guarantee that they're going to extend your lifespan by 20 years. But if we look at animal experiments with different interventions, it is possible to extend lifespan of humans by 20 years. I think what's really interesting is this 20 years, it can potentially open up a lot of other opportunities to step up improvement in health, because every year we're seeing a lot of improvements in the longevity science, a lot of improvements in bioengineering and genetic engineering, and with the advances in science, but also changes in regulation, we can potentially achieve that breakthrough level and live a lot longer with a better quality. And the third objective is to minimize and kind of shrink the time when it takes to health quality to decline. And you see here that the decline is really steep compared to the normal lifespan, where the decline takes 10 years. So ideally, you want this decline to be as short as possible. And I would argue that you probably want it to be ideally one night. So the best death could be just dying when you sleep of a heart attack, for a couple of reasons. One is you don't struggle, but also people around you don't struggle. So this is the 3 things we want to achieve. But how do we achieve that? I think there's a lot of advice out there that's not really clear. I think the real objective is to prevent heart disease, prevent cancer, prevent stroke, diabetes, and Alzheimer's. And this is really the disease of aging, chronic disease. If you look at the statistics of death by age group, you can see that as you age, a lot of those diseases drive the majority of death, and some of them become more prevalent as you age. So for example, the risk of Alzheimer's goes up significantly when you reach the age of 50. And this graph is pretty simple. It's just death per 100,000 people per year from different disease. So objectives are clear. We want to stay healthier for longer, and we also want to live longer. But how do we achieve that? I've been always struggling with a lot of information out there couldn't understand, should I be keto, should I be paleo, should I be vegetarian, vegan, should I eat carbs or should I not eat carbs, should I eat sugar, should I be Mediterranean? Just a lot of different information that's confusing. And so we have to be really systematic about how we learn about longevity. And there are 3 ways to learn about longevity, broadly speaking. Number 1 is observations. And there are different categories of observations. And today we're going to talk about the major one, which is research in centenarians. And centenarians are people who lived past 100 years old. And really what you're looking at these people and comparing them with other groups, and you're looking at what is the health profile of these people, what is the genetic profile of these people, what is the habit profile of these people, and you compare it to other age groups and other populations. Number 2 is experiments, and in experiments we can look at different things. One is we can look at animals, for example, mice and rats and monkeys. And the beauty of looking at mice, rats, and monkeys is that they have a pretty similar disease onset profile. So they're usually pretty healthy in the first part of their life, and they're not so healthy in the second part of their life. And we can test different interventions to see what's working to extend this lifespan and to also keep them healthier. And the benefit is obviously they live a lot shorter. And we can then take these learnings to humans. Not all of this would be transferable, but some of this research would be transferable. And we can also do some research, experimental research in humans, but this would be shorter term, and it's really hard to see the longer term impact on this of these interventions on humans. And number 3 is self-experiments, and I really want to highlight self-experiments because self-experiments is important because our bodies are different. We all react differently to different foods. We all have different objectives. So as much as I want to learn from observations, experiments, I do want to highlight that self-experimentation is very important. And on this picture, this is my glucose level 4 hours into fast and 48 hours into the fast. And I'm pretty proud of these numbers. Actually, so I had a 65 milligrams per deciliter 48 hours into the fast, which I was proud about. But it turned out actually this morning I had 68, which is also pretty good after only 15 hours of fasting. But we'll talk more about glucose in a second. I do want to highlight that self-experimentation is important, and measuring glucose is one of the ways to think about self-experimentation. So what do we learn from centenarians? So first of all, bad news from centenarians is they mostly do not exhibit healthy behavior. They do not eat healthier. Some of them smoke. Some of them actually smoke more. They don't eat healthier, that they don't work out more. Some of them do, but some of them don't. So it's really hard to see healthier behavior. But the good news from centenarians is that they can prevent onset of chronic disease by having a few useful genetic qualities. And they're broadly classified into 3 groups. One is improved fat and glucose uptake. Number 2 is inhibited growth hormones, specifically genes related to insulin-like growth factor 1 and growth hormone, GHR. And they also have lower inflammation levels. It's actually not exactly clear why they have lower inflammation levels. There's a few hypotheses. One possibility is that they have a gut microbiome structure. So we all have gut microbes. We all have bacteria in our bodies, and they do help a lot with calming down inflammation and digesting food. And it turns out that centenarians have a gut microbiome structure that is very similar to a 30-year-old. And that's a possibility for calming down inflammation and keeping lower inflammation levels. And another possibility could be that centenarians actually just eat healthier. And maybe we're seeing this specific artifact in centenarians that live in Okinawa or in Italy, and they eat a lot of fish. And that's why and fish is obviously, it's loaded with omega-3 fats, and it's anti-inflammatory. So we don't exactly know. And the next question is, So what? They have genetic qualities, but how do we care about their genetic qualities given that we can't really change our genes? We can change our genes, at least for now. I'm very hopeful that soon there will be more breakthroughs, but also there will be changes in regulation that would let people who wanted to make changes in their genes. We can actually adopt behavior upregulating the longevity pathways. And specifically, we can do two things, or three things here. One is we can get a better glucose uptake and fat metabolism. We can introduce periods of deprived nutrients, and we can also lower inflammation levels. And if we look at animal experiments and human experiments and yeast experiments, we see that introducing changes in the behavior that are upregulating this longevity pathways, they do help extend lifespan, and they do help prevent the onset of chronic disease. So in this presentation, I want to jump deeper into the three areas and provide you the 20% of things you can do to get 80% of the output to upregulate this longevity pathways. Let's look into why glucose and insulin is important for longevity. So first of all, what is glucose and insulin? It's very clear what glucose and insulin is, but I still want to spend a second here. Glucose is obviously the main source of fuel in our bodies, and insulin is a hormone produced by the pancreas that helps glucose enter the cells of our body. So imagine that glucose runs in our blood flow and it wants to feed your cells, and it enters cells through receptors called GLUTs. And what insulin does, it translocates GLUTs, essentially glucose transporters, to the cell surface, and it helps glucose enter the cell and start feeding the cell. So ideally for longevity, we want low glucose and low insulin. And here's a simplification of what good glucose regulation is. On the left side, you see blood glucose, and 50 milligrams per deciliter is a low glucose level. You'd probably hit 50 milligrams per deciliter if you fast for about 7 days, and then it would stay constant. And 200 plus is a very high glucose level. It's essentially a hyperglycemia. It's pretty much a diabetic level. So ideally, you want somewhere between 85 and 90 milligrams per deciliter on average per day. But what's really important is you really want to look at the average, and you really want to look at the jumps between the max and minimum. And you don't want to have a lot of the jumps between maximum and minimum. You want to have between 15 and 20 milligrams per deciliter standard deviation. So really, if we look at the bad glucose regulation, even if it's a normal average of 85, 90, but it's high jumps, it's still pretty bad for us for a number of reasons, which we'll talk about in a second. But you can feel glucose spikes and slumps if you feel energy ups and downs during the day. It means that your glucose goes ups and down. This is a good indicator because it's really not so practical to measure glucose every hour during the day. I do it on some days, but it's not very practical. So a good indicator is just your level of energy. So why is elevated glucose and insulin bad? It's bad for a few reasons. Number one is inflammation. And I really want to stop on inflammation for a second. Really want to stop on what happens when your glucose levels are elevated for a long time. When your glucose levels are elevated, blood glucose levels, circulating blood with glucose, glucose starts binding with amino acids in your body, and they form what's called advanced glycation end products, or AGEs. And AGEs lead to formation of senescent cells. And senescent cells is obviously one of the most known markers of aging. And senescent cells are cells that are essentially zombie cells or dead cells that are still there, but they don't function properly. And so you don't want to have elevated blood glucose for a long time. High glucose also leads to hunger and overeating, and here's why. Let's talk about how glucose is used in the body for a second, and let's take a hypothetical case of a person whose glucose or kilocalorie needs, really not glucose, but just fuel needs are 3,000 kilocalories per day, just an average person. And for that person, his liver capacity is 400 kilocalories. So his liver can only store 400 kilocalories, and the rest is stored in his muscles and fat cells. However, his brain would consume about 20% of the calories. So for that person with 3,000 calories, his brain would consume about 600 to 700 kilocalories. So what happens if you ate something and this energy goes into the liver and into the muscles? Your brain is only able to get that energy from the liver. Your muscles are unable to transform energy or glucose into the brain. It only can go into the brain from the liver. And muscles can only burn this energy by walking, by exercising. So what's interesting is when you eat something, your liver stores of glycogen or glucose are filled. This goes into the brain. You feel energy spike. But then because your liver is a small container of glucose, but your brain is a large consumer of glucose and it only gets energy from the liver, you would soon get an energy slump. And so you would want to go and eat again. So this leads to hunger and overeating. So you start eating and eating and eating. So it not only leads to hunger and overeating, but also leads to fatigue and low cognitive energy, because really the only time when you're productive is when you ate something sugary. And this is obviously not, it's not possible to keep that mode for a long time, because you would need to eat and eat and eat. And it would lead down the line to obviously disease and diabetes. So really you want to avoid those high glucose spikes. Number 4 is glucose leads to inhibited melatonin secretion. And this is especially important for dinner meals, not eating sugary meals for dinner. It's been found that glucose and insulin both in different directions. So if there's high glucose, there's low melatonin. And melatonin really is a sleep hormone, obviously. Not exactly clear why glucose inhibits melatonin secretion, but potentially that happened evolutionary, because glucose for us is a source of energy. So potentially there's danger we need glucose to run. And if you need to run, you don't need to sleep. You don't need a lot of melatonin. So really you need to avoid eating anything sugary for before you go to bed for dinner. And number 5 is a higher risk of pancreas disease. And obviously if you have a high glucose level, your insulin is also always high, and insulin is produced by the pancreas. So there's constant stress on pancreas, and you want to avoid that stress by exercising as much as possible to get rid of the glucose, but also to improve your insulin and sensitivity. So your body, your pancreas wouldn't need to produce that much insulin anymore. Now let's look into the longevity menu. And the longevity menu, I really want to simplify it here. Just provide a simple framework. Let's look at accelerated aging and anti-aging. And on the accelerated aging side, we obviously have sugary stuff, soda drinks, Coca-Cola, ice cream, sweets. Interestingly, salad dressings and ketchup would also be here. So there's a lot of hidden sources of sugar, and in this case, it's specifically high fructose corn syrup, which is actually even worse than glucose, because it's not absorbed by the muscles. It's only absorbed by the liver. So more stress on your liver. Now you would ask, why do we have whole grain products here in cereal, even though they wouldn't necessarily have sugar and they shouldn't have sugar? Well, they have what's called the WGA, or wheat germ agglutinin, and they lead to a phenomenon called insulin mimicking. So WGAs, they act in a similar way to insulin, and so they would translocate GLUT receptors, and they would dock onto the GLUT receptors and make it seem that your cells are ready to get glucose into your cells, but in reality they're not. So WGAs wouldn't let glucose into the cells, So you would feel hunger, you would feel that you want to consume more and more, but your WGAs wouldn't let glucose in. So you would be hungry, your cells would be hungry, and some of cells may potentially die. This leads to inflammation down the line. So there's a lot of downfall effects that result from consuming whole grain products and cereal and really WG. And on the anti-aging side, we have a few products here. I try to simplify it. Obviously, there's a lot more stuff you can eat, but I just focus on a few most important things. One is nuts. And here are some high quality nuts, high fat content, and low carb content. And even if it's carbs, it's low release carbs, so they don't lead to a spike in your glucose levels. Avocados are obviously a great fruit, high fat, high quality fat. Berries are pretty good, even though they're a little bit sweet, but it's really low glycemic index. And coconuts and coconut oil, coconut milk is really great stuff for you to live without sugar and be very energetic on this low sugar diet. So now you would ask, can I still enjoy treats? And the answer is yes, you can obviously enjoy treats. And those treats, I would argue, are even better because they make you stronger, they make you think better, and they're also very tasty. So these days when I work from home, I consume a lot of this. Just a few examples here, some cakes that are based on nut flour, not wheat flour, but rather nut flour. They use some grass-fed butter, grass-fed cream, coconut milk. They use stevia instead of sugar. So really, you can be really creative about how you think and how you create these cakes, but I would say that they're even tastier than the real sugar, and they're definitely healthier than the real sugar. So the next one is nutrient sensing. And really, nutrient sensing is about two things, growth and regression. And we evolutionarily did not evolve in isolation from the environment. Food wasn't available 24/7, 365 days a year over the last few thousand years. There were periods of growth and regression. And summer is a growth period when a lot of the genes are upregulated, and winter is a period when a lot of the genes are silenced or downregulated. And really where we are now, we are really on the growth side. So we have a lot of food. We have really high caloric foods, high amino acid content foods that lead to growth. So from a longevity perspective, what you want actually more regression than growth. Now let's zoom into what growth and regression is. So on the growth side, we have what's called mTOR, and mTOR is, it stands for mammalian target of rapamycin, and IGF-1 is insulin-like growth factor 1, or it's essentially a hormone that is a primary mediator of human growth hormone in our bodies. So on the left side, both pathways lead to cell growth and cell proliferation. And on the right side, we have AMPK and SIRT1 or sirtuin. This is the two examples of the major longevity pathways, and they have a lot of beneficial effects on the body. One of them is when you upregulate these pathways, this leads to autophagy. And autophagy, some of you may have heard of autophagy. This is what you get when you do intermittent fasting, and this is a regulated cell recycling process where old cells, worn out cells, get recycled in a structured process in the body, and we essentially get rid of the old stuff and renew our bodies. So for the longevity, you do want to have more regression than growth. So how do you get into the regression mode more than the growth mode? It turns out there are two major ways to get there. One is caloric restriction, and the other one is dietary restriction. And really, caloric restriction is about how many calories you consume. So in that hypothetical example of a person with 3,000 calories, consuming 2,000 calories would be a caloric restriction, and it would activate the anti-aging pathways. And the dietary restriction is the chemical composition of your meals, and specifically two things that are important. One is products containing IGF-1 or insulin-like growth factor 1, and certain amino acids, specifically methionine and leucine. And this is the two amino acids that are really the primary mediators of muscle growth in your body. And on the left side here, on the accelerated aging side, we have cow's milk and dairy products. A lot of them do have a lot of IGF, especially conventional products. And even pasteurization doesn't get rid of the IGF. So this IGF from the milks, because they were fed with IGF, and milk generally contains a lot of IGF. Think about breastfed breast milk for humans. And also meat has a lot of amino acids, methionine and leucine, specifically red meat. So you don't want to consume a lot of that meat. And the third one here is brain chain amino acids. This is for folks who like to work out. They do want to grow muscle, so they may be consuming brain chain amino acids, but really from a longevity perspective, that's not a very good idea if you want to extend your lifespan and pause the growth mode. So on the anti-aging side, what you want to do is you want to cycle periods of low caloric availability, and you see here an empty plate. And I personally try to skip 1 or 2 meals a day. So I try to limit myself to ideally just 1 meal a day. And you also want to try to minimize the amount of amino acids that you consume. I personally consume about 4 to 6 ounces of red meat a week, and I make sure to consume high quality meat. And if I do consume dairy and milk products, I consume goat's products, goat's milk or goat's cheese, because it's less, it has less IGF, so it activates less of the growth pathways, and you can still be kind of in the regression mode here. The next question is, we all live our lives, so how do we realize that in reality? And this is an example of a simple office meal for longevity, which I create every day when I go to the office. I use 1 avocado, use some soaked walnuts, steamed broccoli, Brussels sprouts, blackberries, some cold greens, and a lot of olive oil, because olive oil activates a lot of the anti-aging and anti-inflammatory pathways. It's almost medicinal in its properties. And this meal has about 700 calories, and even though it's low in caloric content, but because it's a big meal, I can still feel full, and I can still go most of the day on this just 1 meal. So the third area I want to stop on is inflammation. And inflammation is really a broad topic, but we'll dive into a few areas of inflammation. So first of all, let's look at the biological clock. And biological clock is called, our daily biological clock is called circadian clock, circadian rhythm. It's a rhythm of 24 hours. And what's interesting in this 24-hour rhythm, we have different genes upregulated or downregulated. And it evolved this way to make sure that we are able to run different processes at different times of the day. And what scientists say that circadian clock upregulates or downregulates about 20% of the genes at different times of the day. And from a longevity perspective, our objective is to live according to the circadian clock. And I would say that if you only want to take one thing out of all this presentation, it is that you should minimize the eating window. And on this simple chart, we have obviously 24 hours from 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. To 6 p.m. and to 12 a.m. are 24 hours. And the question is, what are the periods of no eating, eating, and no eating? And I would say that the best time is to shrink your eating window to 12 hours or less. So this is called time restricted eating or intermittent fasting. So you want to do 12 hours, or potentially over time you can go to 6 hours to 4 hours. And what's important is that you don't want to consume any calories outside of this window, because being in this window helps you upregulate your longevity pathways every day. even though you'll be getting enough calories to be productive. I personally started to eat it in about a 3 or 4 hour window. Previously, so I usually eat some dark chocolate, for 100% chocolate for breakfast. Then I have lunch. And I previously shrunk this to 2 hours, but I did feel a very significant glucose spike because I was consuming a lot of calories and a lot of amino acids in just one meal. So I suddenly felt a energy slump. And so I decided to extend this window for 4 hours, and now I feel much better. I think what's important is that you don't want to consume breakfast and dinner, or you don't want to consume early lunch or dinners. You do want to have breakfast or lunch and dinner. So you want to shrink this as much as possible. And from a longevity perspective, this is actually one of the most important interventions that you can have. Now, the next one is what's called gut-blood barrier, and we really need to focus on gut-blood barrier for a few reasons. One is gut-blood barrier. If you think about how our bodies work, we have digestive system, stomach, intestines, and we have evolved to digest the good stuff and get rid of the bad stuff. So you don't want pro-inflammatory compounds getting into your blood flow. And what happens when you consume certain products, you actually do get this inflammatory compounds getting into your blood flow and producing inflammation and leading to, in some cases, autoimmune disease. And what happens is our stomachs, they have what's called a mucus lining, and mucus lining is it's essentially a lot of cells that protect our blood flow from anything that's large enough, that's inflammatory, but it cannot get into the blood flow. So when you start consuming things like products high in lectins, or things like ibuprofen or Advil, when you start consuming fast foods and commercial brands, some sulfur preservatives, some other stuff, it leads to leaky gut because it destroys the mucus lining, and all of these inflammatory compounds get into the blood flow. One of them is called LPS, or lipopolysaccharide. And this is really a dead bacteria, which is not dangerous for us in any sense, but it still has the receptors on it that trigger inflammatory response in the body. So when it gets into the blood flow, we do have inflammation, even though this is not a dangerous compound in any sense. So you do want to make sure that you don't consume these products or minimize them. And also, if you do eat products that are high in lectins, and I'm not going to stop here on lectins because it's a broad topic, but there are some ways to cook foods that help to minimize lectins. Now, the next area is gut microbiome. And I previously mentioned that gut microbiome of centenarians is very similar to gut microbiome of 30 years olds. And gut microbiome is an important topic because really, if you think about our guts and intestines, stomach, intestines, and overall the gut system, we only have 2% of the human genes, and 98% of these genes are bacterial genes that help digest foods and that help calm down inflammation. And so overall, you do want to make sure that you have a right composition of microbes in your gut. And if you look on the accelerated aging side, you want to minimize things like artificial sweeteners. And even though Diet Coke is slow in sugar, it has no sugar, in fact, but it does kill your microbiome. Also, you don't want to consume products that were fed with antibiotics. And a lot of the conventional meats were fed with antibiotics, and even though in a lot of cases it can't go directly to you through meat, so you don't get antibiotics, but you do get antibiotic resistant bacteria. Unfortunately, in some cases you do even get this bacteria through vegetables, because vegetables were fed with manure from beef that was raised on antibiotics. So also consume organic vegetables, ideally. And then when you consume, obviously, salad dressing, ketchup, they also, in a lot of cases, have things that lead to death of your gut microbiome. And on the anti-aging side, you want to consume a few things. One is you do want to consume plenty of vegetables. Cruciferous vegetables are the best ones. Broccoli and cauliflower, they have a lot of compounds that act as locks, which unlock anti-inflammatory pathways in the body. Another group of products are called resistant starch, and resistant starch is type of starch that passes stomach and goes directly into your intestines and feed good bacteria there. A few examples of products that you want to eat. One is green bananas. You do want to eat very green, but you don't want to eat very green bananas because they taste kind of gross. But you do want to consume the bananas that are somewhere in between the very green and the yellow. Still not sweet, but still nice to consume. The second type of product is called, sweet potato yums. And in order to produce resistant starch, you need to cook them and cool them. And when you do that, resistant starch is formed. And you can do the same with white rice, ideally white rice. And then also chocolate is a great source of good fiber that helps feed your bacteria. Before we finish, let's look at a few more things. Number one is alcohol. Is it good or is it bad? Well, the answer is it depends. Alcohol decreases glutathione production in the body. First of all, what is glutathione? Glutathione is a master antioxidant produced in our liver, and it's used to fight different types of stress, oxidative stress in our bodies, not only in the liver, but across all of our body. So what happens when you drink alcohol, it puts an increased stress on your liver. So your liver is able to produce less glutathione, but it also needs more glutathione to fight the stress produced by the alcohol. So the result is there's less glutathione available in the body overall, but there's also less portion of the glutathione that's available to fight other types of stress and support other processes. Number two, alcohol leads to issues with DNA methylation and gene expression. And this is a very deep scientific topic, and we can spend an hour here, but simply, it potentially leads to DNA damage and also epigenetic damage. So this is obviously what you want to avoid, and you don't want to consume a lot of alcohol. And number three, a lot of the alcohol drinks are sweetened, and they're sweetened with fructose. So what's interesting about fructose, fructose is only metabolized by the liver. If you remember from the previous chapter, your liver is a small container of glucose and fructose. It's only capable of storing about 400 kilocalories. So when you drink fructose drinks, this fructose goes into your liver, but your liver is unable to store it in a normal capacity. And your liver starts to store that longer term as fat, and it's called a fatty liver disease. That's actually one of the reasons why when you eat sugary fruits, for example, or a very sugary dessert, you kind of feel bloated. It's not because you suddenly became fat, but it's because your liver is really stressed with a lot of fructose. So on the positive side, alcohol is capable of producing what's called hormesis, and hormesis is a beneficial type of stress. The most important benefit of hormesis is a cardiovascular benefit, so it's good for our heart health, for example. But it's not clear how much alcohol is beneficial. 1 glass of wine is likely okay. Are 2 glasses okay? 3 glasses okay? Well, science is not so clear about it. And the second benefit of alcohol is resveratrol, but resveratrol is only found in red wine. And resveratrol is a longevity compound found in the skin of the grapes. And it's been shown that resveratrol is extending mice and rats' lifespan by about 20 to 30%. So theoretically, resveratrol is a longevity compound. And if we look at certain centenarian populations, such as populations in Sardinia and Italy, they drink a lot of red wine, so maybe that's why they live longer, but it's not clear. So I personally think about alcohol in two ways. One is toxicity and the other one is benefits. And toxicity is broadly defined as mold toxicity and also alcohol toxicity. And benefits is really low and high benefits. And what we're looking for, we want to be in the upper right quadrant. We want to be high benefits and low toxicity. And the only drink that's potentially there is red wine. And the reason is red wine, obviously, as I mentioned, has a resveratrol, which is a longevity compound. But the issue is some of the red wine may be contaminated with molds because red wine is produced from the grape skin, and grape skin has a risk of mold contamination. So it's not really clear where on the spectrum of toxicity red wine is. And you have to be careful about what type of wine you drink. And there are some ratings of mold contamination for red wine, which you can find online. And the second one is white wine. White wine doesn't use the grape skin, so there's a lot lower risk of mold contamination. But unfortunately, because it doesn't use grape skin, it doesn't have resveratrol, so the benefits are also low. The next one is vodka and whiskey, so kind of this strong alcohol drinks. I think of them as being kind of medium toxic because they still have a lot of alcohol, but they also have a lot of, or actually pretty low benefits. So maybe you can drink a little bit, but I wouldn't drink a lot for longevity purposes. Unfortunately, beer is the one that's potentially very high toxicity and low benefit. And the reason is it's high toxicity is because it uses wheat. Wheat is used to produce beer, and wheat has a very high risk of mold contamination, and it also contaminates beer. And also beer is phytoestrogenic. Phytoestrogenic means that it mimics estrogen in our bodies. And estrogen is obviously a female hormone, and it is especially dangerous for males because it can lead to a lot of weight gain. So beer is unfortunately the one that's pretty dangerous. Now, what about supplements? Unfortunately, I cannot recommend any supplements, but a few most critical ones to consider are as follows. One is B12 and folate. And if you consume B12 and folate, you want to make sure you consume this specific forms. The reason they are important is specifically for folate, for example, about 60% of Americans have a genetic deficiency that makes their folate synthesis in the bodies inefficient. And a large percentage of people have a B12 deficiency and a B12 genetic deficiency. So these people want to supplement B12 and folate, and you want to supplement them together because they work synergetically. They have a lot of brain benefits and nerve benefits. Number two is D3 and K2. And D3, even though it's called a vitamin, but in reality, it's actually a hormone that has a lot of functions in the body. Unfortunately, the guidelines for D3 supplementation are very low. I think it's about 600 IU for an adult, which is extremely low. The vitamin D Council in the US recommends about 1,000 IU per 25 pounds of body weight. So I personally consume about, my weight is about 150 pounds, and I consume about 7,000 IU per day. And you also want to use K2 to aid calcium synthesis because you really want to have D3 and K2 together, but you also want to look at your blood clotting characteristics to make sure that you can consume K2. The third one is omega-3, and omega-3 is obviously an anti-inflammatory fatty acid that is found mostly in fish and krill oil. It's also found in large amounts in grass-fed beef, for example. And you want to consume omega-3 with some aspirin. And the reason is aspirin helps unlock what's called resolvins in omega-3, and resolvins are anti-inflammatory compounds. So it makes omega-3 a lot more effective. And there's a couple of studies out there that look at a long-term supplementation of aspirin. And they found that in a 20-year horizon, aspirin decreased a cancer rate by about 50%. So this is really a pretty cheap way to decrease your cancer risk. 81 milligrams enteric coated, this is what I consume every day. There are some potential risks with consuming aspirin, but they're very low. I think there's a small risk of internal bleeding with aspirin, but it's only applicable to people with underlying conditions and also older population. So I wouldn't be too worried about it. The benefits greatly outweigh the potential downsides. Number 3 is curcumin, and curcumin is an ancient Indian plant, and the 2 major benefits are, number 1 is sugar regulation, so it helps you keep your blood glucose level lower, and number 2, it helps keep your mucous lining more intact, so it helps fight the leaky gut and it helps fight inflammation in the body. And the 5th one is N-acetylcysteine, and this is NAC, or a precursor to glutathione. We talked about glutathione before, which is a major antioxidant. Really good compound. I make sure to consume enough NAC. If I drink 1 glass of red wine, I usually consume 2 or 3 capsules of NAC to make sure that my body is able to fight the alcohol stress. So one last thing, don't forget to exercise. Exercise has been shown to extend lifespan, and if you only have 1 choice of exercise, heavy muscle exercise is likely best, because muscles help dispose glycogen or glucose. And remember that excess muscles accelerate aging, so you don't want to be a bodybuilder, but you do want to have some moderate muscles. So stay moderate, but make sure to exercise enough. I hope that you found this useful. If you're interested in more detail, please feel free to check out my profile on Medium, medium.com/Longify, where we dive into a lot more detail on longevity, key longevity pathways, and key longevity interventions. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.